Welcome back to Ramsey Dewey on Religion and Philosophy. Let's speak a bit about Jesus today. Luke chapter 2, verse 52, from the King James Bible reads thusly, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man." So we don't have a great deal of information about the early life of Jesus. We have a little bit. A little bit. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and later on, when he was about 2 years old, his family moved to Egypt, and he spent his early childhood in North Africa. At about age 12, he came back to Israel, went to the temple age 12, and spoke to the learned priests and doctors of the law, had some conversations with them, and astounded them. They were astounded by his doctrine. And he was just a kid. So there's a lot of speculation about how Jesus came to be who he was and how he was. And right here, Luke tells us, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little and there a little from grace to grace. Imagine for a minute the type of faith that Jesus had to exercise to be who he was. He was born like one of us, as a human child, like one of us, completely dependent on his mother, like one of us, and then is tasked with knowing who he is, the Son of God. Imagine for a moment how he must have felt upon learning this. But this is interesting. These four things. Jesus increased in wisdom, in other words, mentally, cognitively, as far as intelligence goes. In stature, he got better physically. In favor with God, spiritually, and in favor with man, socially. So these four things, mental, physical, spiritual, and social, these are important. Why? Because the devil wants us to be the opposite. The devil wants us to be stupid, ignorant, and unwise instead of smart, intelligent, instead of increasing in wisdom. The devil wants us to be too weak and unhealthy and addicted and not in control of our own bodies, as opposed to increasing physically in stature like Christ did. Why? Well, he doesn't have a body and he wants ours. He wants us separate from God as much as possible, and one of the simplest ways to do that, well, how do we make our choices? We make them with our body. And if he controls that, he controls you. The devil wants us to be separate from God and unbelieving, which is the opposite of what Christ did, increasing in favor with God, spiritually becoming better and better in every way, every day. The devil wants us to be separate from God, unbelieving, getting worse and worse and worse. The devil wants us to be socially inept. And this is interesting. Jesus increased in favor not just with God, but also with man. Why? He had a message to deliver, the most important message to deliver that has ever been delivered. What happened the first time Jesus stepped out to preach in his hometown? He was rejected by the people who knew him, who grew up with him. They were like, "That's Jesus from down the road. That's Joe's boy. That's the carpenter's kid. What's he doing? Who does he think he is? You think you're better than us, Jesus? We know you. We know your mom. We know your dad. We know your brothers and sisters. Come on, man, not cool. Get out of here with that act, dude." And Jesus said, "A prophet is never accepted in his own country," and he left and he preached elsewhere. I think he learned something important from that experience. It is important to increase socially with man. Why? To get the message out, man, to get the message out. If you want to have a positive influence on the world, the key word there is influence. If you have no influence, you're out of luck. I took a songwriting class once, and on the first day of class, this was in college, the professor said, "Look, I've heard some songwriters out there in the Appalachian Mountains who can outplay, outperform, are technically better, have beautiful voices in every single way than anyone you have ever heard on the radio. And you will never hear them. They will never make a dime off of their music. As far as pop music is concerned, why not? Why not? Because you will never hear them. Because they're hillbillies living in the mountains. They have no influence. And so if you want to be a successful songwriter, not just a good songwriter, a successful songwriter, or should I say a song seller, if you want to have your music heard, and isn't that why we write songs in the first place? Because we want them to be heard. Well, then we need to have influence. Influence on the world, influence on those around us. And look, if we're sharing the message of Christ and we have no influence whatsoever, if we're socially inept, we don't know how to talk, we have zero charisma, we have nobody who cares about anything we have to say because we just don't understand how to communicate with people. That's a problem. That's a problem. Now, why does that matter? We just talked about why that matters. Look, Jesus wasn't simply given everything at once. That happened over time. He had to put in the work. He had to do his due diligence. This is so fascinating to me. I hate the devil, man. He's the worst. And I had a friend who would always say, you can't say hate. We don't hate anyone. You're only allowed to hate Satan and Hitler, and that's it. But, man, the devil's the worst. He's the worst because he wants the worst for us. He wants us to be stupid, weak, separated from God, and socially inept. Do you want to be those things? Like, even the most godless atheist out there, you don't want to be stupid, you don't want to be weak, and you certainly don't want to be inept. You might not care about being separated from God if you don't believe in him, but you don't want those other things. But you know who does want those things for you? The devil. And if you don't believe in God, well, you probably don't believe in the devil either, right? And vice versa. But that's exactly what he wants. He wants you stupid, weak, separated from God, unbelieving, unfaithful, and socially inept without any influence. People often ask me, Ramsey, why don't you drink alcohol? Why don't you drink coffee? Why don't you drink tea? Why don't you try tobacco? Not so much tobacco anymore because, when I was a kid, I got asked this a lot. Like, hey, Ramsey, here's some chewing tobacco. Why don't you try some? No, thank you. I'm not going to do that. First of all, I'm underage because I'm a kid. I was a teenager. And secondly, my religion forbids it. Well, why? Mine doesn't. I go to church. Not your church, but in my church, nobody cares. Well, in mine, God cares about how I take care of my body. Why? Why? Because he wants me to be in control of my body as opposed to the other way around. He wants me to be healthy. Why? So I'm able to do the work that he has for me to do. He wants me to be in control as opposed to an addiction controlling me. And man, there are so many addictions out there in the world today. When I was a kid and we talked about addiction, we all thought about drugs because it was part of Ronald Reagan's war on drugs or whoever was doing that back in the day. Just say no, kids. Dare, man, dare. Remember the DARE program? Anyway, there was so much anti-drug stuff out there that I got in my mind that drugs are the only addiction. They're not, man. You can get addicted to spending your time in so many ways. You can get addicted to playing video games, addicted to screens, addicted to YouTube, addicted to pornography, addicted to all kinds of vices. Anything that gets your brain chemistry tingling and lighting up, boom, 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 you can get addicted to that. And an addiction is a compulsion to behave a certain way, a compulsion. Do you know who wants to compel you to behave a certain way? The devil. The devil wants to compel you. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, God, he has the power to compel you, but he chooses not to. Instead, he simply asks us. Love the Lord your God above all else and love your neighbor as yourself. Are you going to do that? Yeah? Great. Awesome. Are you going to do that? No? Oh, too bad. It's a simple choice, man. Do you know about the Book of Mormon? Where are my Mormons out there? Look up Alma chapter 48. It's one of the books of the Book of Mormon. Verses 11 through 13 and also verse 17. Let's read verse 17 first. I'm going to look that up. I got it on my phone here. Let's see. There it is. Verse 17. Here we have a story about a man named Moroni. Moroni was a captain of an army, and he was out there fighting a war for the liberty of his country. His country was threatened by a foreign power that were trying to not just conquer them, but destroy them, their way of life, their religion, everything they knew and loved. And Moroni wasn't just a mighty man, he was a mighty man of God. And the author of the Book of Mormon says this about Moroni. He says, Yea, verily I say unto you, if all men had been and were and ever would be like unto Moroni, behold, the very powers of hell would have been shaken forever. Yea, the devil would never have power over the hearts of the children of men. That's a bold statement. Who is this guy? What was he like? If all men could be like him, the very powers of hell would be shaken forever. The devil would have no power over the hearts of the children of men. What was this guy like? I want to be like that, don't you? Well, let's read about that. A little earlier, we have a description of how Moroni was like. Verse 11 of chapter 48, And Moroni was a strong and a mighty man. Oh, look at that. He increased himself physically in stature, even as Christ did. He was a man of perfect understanding. Oh, look at that. He's a man who increased in wisdom, just like Christ did. Yea, a man that did not delight in bloodshed, a man whose soul did joy in the liberty and the freedom of his country, and his brethren from bondage and slavery. Yea, a man whose heart did swell with thanksgiving to his God for the many privileges and blessings which he bestowed upon his people. Yea, a man who did labor exceedingly for the welfare and safety of his people. Yea, he was a man who was firm in the faith of Christ, and he had sworn with an oath to defend his people, his rights, his country, and his religion, even to the loss of his own blood. This is a man who increased in favor with God. This is a man who was willing to sacrifice himself for the greater good. Who else did that? How about Jesus? This is a man who tried to be like Jesus. And when you do those things, man, this was a mighty man who led armies to success. Yeah, he had his act together socially. He increased in favor with God and man. Like who? Like Jesus, which is something we should all do. Every last one of us. No, Moroni was not Jesus, but he asked himself some simple questions. What would Jesus do? He would increase in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. He would be in control of his mind, of his body, of his heart, of his soul, of his spirit, and his social aptitudes. Why does that matter? That matters so that we can do the work of God, my friends. And that is exactly why Satan wants the opposite for us. Thanks for watching. If you have comments or questions, leave them in the comment section down below. There, I believe it is. I'm Ramsey Dewey. Who are you? See you next time.